Good afternoon. Today's talk will be on Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem Dejection and Ode. Dejection and Ode is a poem written by Coleridge in 1802. The poem in its original form was written to Sarah Hutchinson, a woman who was not his wife, but initial evidence tells us that she was his object of affection. The poem initially discusses his feelings of love for her. The various versions of the poem describe Coleridge's inability to write poetry and living in a state of paralysis, as it were, but subsequent published editions remove his personal feelings and mention of Sarah Hutchinson. In the poem as we have it today, we find that the speaker begins the poem by recalling another poem that tells the tale of Sir Patrick Spens. In this poem, the moon takes on a certain strange appearance that presages the coming of a storm. The story of Sir Patrick Spens, to which the poet alludes here, is an ancient Scottish ballad about a sailor who drowns with a boatload of Scottish noblemen, sailing on orders from the king, but against his own better judgment. It contains lines that refer to the moon as a definitive predictor of storms, which Coleridge quotes as an epigraph for his ode. Coleridge says, late yesterday I saw the new moon, the old moon in her arms, and I fear my master dear, we shall have a deadly storm. The speaker declares that if the author of the poem possessed a sound understanding of weather or how the weather develops in the course of a day or a night, then it was sure that a storm would break on this night as well, for the moon now looks as it did in the poem of Sir Patrick Spens. The speaker wishes ardently for the storm to erupt, for the violence of the squall might cure his numb feeling. He says that he feels only a dull pain, a grief without a pang, a constant deadening of all his feelings. Speaking to a woman whom he addresses as "O Lady," he admits that he has been gazing at the western sky all evening, able to see its beauty, but unable to fully feel it. He says that staring at the green sky will never raise his spirits, for no outward forms can effectively generate feelings, since emotions can only come from within, without any reference or influence of any external agency. According to the speaker, he says, we receive but what we give. The soul itself must provide the light by which we may hope to see nature's true beauty. And this idea was true for most of the romantic poets. It's a beauty not given to the common crowd of human beings, commonly referred to as the poor, loveless, ever anxious crowd, unquote. Calling the lady pure of heart, the speaker says that she already knows about the light and music of the soul, which is joy. Joy, he says, brings us closer to nature, marries us to nature, thereby giving us a new earth and a new heaven undreamt of by the sensual and the proud. Unquote. The speaker subsequently insists that there was a time when he was full of hope, when every tribulation was simply the material with which fancy made me dreams of happiness, quote unquote. But now his afflictions press him to the earth. He does not mind the decline of his mirth, but he cannot bear or tolerate the corresponding degeneration of his imagination, which is the source of his creativity and his understanding of the human condition. That which enables him very, very powerfully to construct, Coleridge says, from my own nature all the natural man, unquote. Hoping to escape the viper thoughts, quote unquote, that coil round his mind. The speaker turns his attention to the howling wind that has begun to blow. He thinks of the world as an instrument played by a musician who spins out of the wind a worse than a wintry song. This melody first calls to mind the rush of an army on the field. Quieting, it then evokes a young girl lost and alone. It is midnight, but the speaker has small thoughts within quotes of sleep. However, he hopes that his friend the lady will be visited by gentle sleep and that she will wake with joyful thoughts and light heart. Calling the lady the friend, devoutest of my choice, quote unquote, the speaker wishes that she might evermore rejoice. And that is how the poem ends. Now, to speak of the form of the poem, the long ode stanzas of Dejection are metered in iambic lines, ranging in length from trimeter to pentameter. The rhymes alternate between the rhymes ABBA and couplet CC, with very rare occasional exceptions. Now, with regard to the importance of the poem, when we study today, we find that Coleridge continues his sophisticated and perhaps complex philosophical exploration of the relationship between man and nature, issues that he dealt with earlier in the Nightingale, namely that human feelings and the forms of nature are essentially separate and not one. Just as the speaker insisted in the earlier poem that the Nightingale's song should not be called melancholy simply because it sounded so to a melancholy poet, he insists here that the beauty of the sky before the storm does not have the power to fill him with joy, for the source of human feeling is essentially within. Only when the human being or the individual has access to that source, so that joy shines from him like a light, is able to see the beauty of nature and to respond to it. Coleridge blames his desolate numbness, which we encountered in the first drift of the ode, for sapping his creative powers and leaving him without his habitual method of understanding human nature. Despite his insistence on the separation between the mind and the world, Coleridge nevertheless continues to find metaphors, and very powerful metaphors at that, for his own feelings in nature. His dejection is reflected in the gloom of the night as it awaits the storm. And it's a dejection from where Coleridge apparently has no escape. As I have informed you earlier, Dejection was written in 1802 but was originally drafted in the form of a letter to Sarah Hutchinson, with the woman Coleridge loved. The much longer version of the original poem contained many of the same elements as Coleridge's other poems, namely The Nightingale and Frost at Midnight, including the same meditation on his children and their natural education. This version also referred explicitly to Sarah, replaced in the latter version by Lady, and William, which was a clear reference to William Wordsworth, Coleridge's friend. Coleridge's strict revision process shortened and tightened the poem, bringing in a unique sense of density to an otherwise supercilious plot. In course of the revisions, the poem was depersonalized, but the earlier drafts hints also at just how important the poem's themes were for Coleridge personally, and indicates that the feelings expressed here were the poet's true beliefs about his own place in the world. The poet had originally been a verse letter. The poem had originally been a verse letter. It became an ode. The first draft had consisted of 16 verse paragraphs, varying in length from 7 to 47 lines, and with further divisions indicated sometimes by indentations. In the final version, there are 8 sections, ranging from 8 to 32 lines. The tone and mood of the verse letter reflect the uncertainty from which it came. The alterations made in the poem in the course of reducing it from 340 lines to 139 lines can be grouped for the sake of convenience under 3 broad headings. The first is those changes made because of the change of addressee. Sarah was replaced by someone else. Those changes which were made in turning a verse letter, which was originally the case, into an ode. And thirdly and most importantly, those which concern the formal pattern of the poem itself. The most extensive changes were made between April the 4th, 1802, when the poem was composed, and October 4th of the same year, when it was established for the first time in the Morning Post. The stanza divisions are different from the Morning Post version from those in the 1817 version, but the poem has 139 lines in October 1802 and the same number 15 years later. In the Morning Post, Sarah Hutchinson had vanished completely, and an Edmund is substituted for her wherever the reader is addressed directly. In the final version of 1817, we encounter a vague lady will be within quotes, who appears, and the reference of pronouns is altered back to visit. In an intermediate version, copied out for Sir George Beaumont, a forthright William had led a brief existence. The changes thus forced upon Coleridge by his change of addressee resulted in a marked improvement in the poem as a whole. For the change is not merely a substitution, but a simplification and a clarification of the motives which had originally led to the composition of the poem. The great fault, if you may call it a fault, of the first version had arisen from some form of a very apparent confusion of motives. The ode as it finally stands is a product of the reconciliation of opposites, a fusion of the two themes of dejection and joy. As Coleridge first wrote it, under the heavy stress of emotion, the dejection to be opposed to joy is confused. It springs from a double motive or impulse. In spite of the poet's attempts to link the two sorts of dejection by setting up a causal relationship between them, they may never form a whole to which joy may be effectively opposed. Coleridge has in the poem progressed through 3 romantic metaphors, the 3 metaphors being nature as a lutanist, nature as an actor, and nature as a poet. He rejects the first because for him it is untrue. Nature cannot essentially be a lutanist, though for her he still wishes that the stars will hang as long as they watch the sleeping earth. Such Wordsworthian perspective of guarding or guiding all youth-playing external world is to the poet, however, not only untrue but also debilitating and perhaps insulting as well. And so he has rejected the metaphor of nature as a lutanist and finally achieved a blending of the other 2 metaphors. This one, that is, once the poet can slough off the weight of the deadening lute metaphor and substitute metaphors of flow and affluence from within, then a new metaphor, that of eddy, presents itself. Interestingly, I.A. Richards, commenting on Coleridge's poems, tell that eddying is one of Coleridge's greatest imaginative triumphs, and even M.H. Abrams another authority on romantic poetry, expands on his crowning metaphor by explaining that the figure implies a ceaseless, the figure implying the figure of this person implies a ceaseless and a circular interchange of life between soul and nature, in which it is impossible to distinguish what is given from what is received. In other words, the image of the eddy so modifies experience that nature is called upon to respond accordingly and appropriately. It too becomes a poet or a co-creator, as it were, with man's imagination of experience. So these roughly are the points that we have to keep in mind while we are reading Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem Dejection and Ode. Thank you.